Before there were heroes, before there were curses, before her name became a whisper spoken with fear, there was only the hush of sacred ground and the soft rhythm of ritual. In those earlier ages, when gods were not distant figures in marble halls, but forces felt in wind and soil, Medusa did not belong to legend. She belonged to the living world, to stone thresholds warmed by sun, to oil lamps flickering in narrow sanctuaries, to the slow breath of prayer rising from ordinary human mouths. In the oldest layers of memory, she was not an ending, but a presence. Not a warning, but a guardian. One of many women whose lives were shaped by devotion, whose bodies were understood not as objects of spectacle, but as vessels of continuity, keeping watch at the invisible crossings where mortal life brushed against divine order. Ancient temples were not merely places of worship. They were borders, lines drawn between safety and chaos, between what could be named and what could not. And at these borders stood human figures, priestesses, attendants, keepers of flame and silent women tasked with holding the fragile space between realms. Their duty was not power, but vigilance. Not command, but endurance. Medusa, in these earlier echoes, is remembered not for what she would become, but for where she stood. She stood at thresholds. In Mediterranean belief, thresholds were never neutral ground. They were places of risk, of passage, of vulnerability. Birth and death both crossed them. Guests entered through them. Spirits were believed to linger near them. To guard a threshold was to guard the body of the community itself, to protect it from unseen intrusion, from spiritual imbalance, from the slow creep of misfortune. To be bound to such work was not glorious. It was constant, quiet, and consuming, but it was sacred. Long before serpents replaced our hair, serpents already moved through the religious imagination of the ancient world, not as threats, but as symbols of renewal, creatures that shed their skin and return, again and again, in endless cycles. They were linked to healing, to earthbound wisdom, to the deep rhythms that governed decay and rebirth alike. In sanctuaries dedicated to older, chthonic deities, those gods of soil, roots, and womb serpents were companions, not enemies. They lived in temple foundations. They were fed by worshippers. They were signs that the sacred had not abandoned the ground. Medusa's later image would inherit this language, though twisted into something unrecognizable. But in these early centuries, serpents did not mean terror. They meant protection. They meant continuity. They meant that life did not end, it transformed. And so too did the women who served at these sacred margins become symbols of endurance rather than fear. Yet devotion has always carried a cost. To belong to the sacred was to surrender the ordinary. Priestesses were set apart from domestic life, from marriage, from inheritance. Their bodies became symbols not of personal identity, but of institutional purity. They were revered, but they were also constrained, bound to codes that demanded silence, discipline, and isolation. Reverence and restriction often shared the same breath. And within that fragile balance, myth begins to take shape not as fantasy, but as cultural memory shaped by pressure and power. Stories form where human experience becomes too heavy to carry in plain speech. Trauma becomes symbol, injustice becomes narrative, and over time meaning shifts, until the human beneath the story is almost unrecognizable. When later poets describe Medusa as once beautiful, they are not merely indulging in tragedy. They are preserving a fragment of older truth that she once existed in a world where she was seen, not hunted, where her presence was not an offense, but a function, where she was woven into the rhythm of sacred life, not cast beyond its edges. But as pantheons changed, so did the roles women were allowed to occupy within them. The rise of Olympian gods marked not only a shift in divine hierarchy, but in cultural values. Earthbound deities, often associated with fertility and cyclical time, gave way to sky gods of law, conquest, and permanence. The sacred moved upward, away from soil and shadow, towards structure and dominance. And in this transformation, older figures were not erased. They were reinterpreted. What had once been protective became threatening. What had once been ambiguous became condemned. And those who stood between worlds, neither fully divine nor comfortably human, were recast as dangers rather than guardians. Medusa's metamorphosis begins here, not in any single violent act, but in a slow, cultural turning, a reshaping of meaning that no individual could stop. In early ritual contexts, fear was not always hostile. It was respectful. It acknowledged the unknown, the uncontrollable, the fragile nature of life. The later traditions increasingly framed fear as something that must be conquered, dominated, subdued, and anything that inspired it became suspect. Women associated with sacred power, especially power tied to sexuality, blood, or transformation, were particularly vulnerable to this shift. Their bodies became battlegrounds where purity and danger were no longer separate categories, but overlapping accusations. Medusa's story, at its root, reflects this tension, not between monster and hero, but between older spiritual orders and newer systems of control, between reverence and regulation, between what cannot be neatly contained and what must be forcibly defined. When myth tells us that her gaze would later turn men to stone, it is tempting to read this as supernatural cruelty. But in psychological memory, stone is not merely death. It is paralysis, shock, the body's response to terror too great to process. Long before it was mythologized, this was a human reaction. The stillness of fear, the silence after violation, the freeze that follows when safety collapses. Medusa does not emerge from myths as a predator. She emerges as a consequence of stories rewritten, of sacred roles abandoned, of human experiences too painful to be spoken directly, reshaped instead into symbols that distance the listener from the wound. And so, in this earliest chapter of her legend, before snakes and swords and severed heads, Medusa is not yet monstrous. She is liminal, positioned between worlds, holding a place that culture both needed and feared. A reminder that long before gods punished and heroes conquered, there were women who stood quietly at the fragile borders of existence, neither worshipped as divinity, nor allowed the safety of ordinary life. Their power was never loud, but it was real. And it unsettled the stories that followed, because history does not always remember what is gentle. It remembers what is traumatic. It remembers what justifies itself. And in that remembering, guardians become monsters, wounds become warnings, and the sacred is recast as something that must be destroyed to feel safe again. Before Medusa was feared, she was trusted. Before she was hunted, she was stationed. Before she was reduced to a face carved into shields and stone, she was a living presence bound to the quiet labor of keeping chaos at bay. And perhaps that is why her story lingers. Because somewhere beneath the layers of horror and heroism, we recognize the outline of something painfully familiar, a figure who bore the weight of boundaries, who suffered transformation not through choice, but through narrative, and whose humanity was slowly buried beneath the needs of a changing world. Before the monster, there was memory. Before the curse, there was duty. And before the legend turned her into stone, she stood at the threshold, holding a space no one else was willing to guard.